Well, welcome to the 700 Club. The White House has finally issued a long-awaited invitation to Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. The gesture comes 7 months after he took office.
Well, President Biden and Netanyahu disagree on several issues crucial to the future of the Jewish state, including an Iranian nuclear deal. Chris Mitchell brings us the details.
According to the Prime Minister's office, President Biden and Netanyahu shared a warm and long call. They discussed regional issues, including the threat from Iran, Israeli-Palestinian relations, and expanding peace in the region. Netanyahu also updated the president on the current status of the judicial reform legislation, a reason for the current rift in their relationship. The invitation did not mention whether the meeting would be at the White House or, as some have suggested, September's UN General Assembly. The invitation came on the eve of Israeli President Isaac Herzog's White House meeting. Herzog then addresses a joint session of Congress on Wednesday. The White House still voiced concerns about Netanyahu's government.
That doesn't mean that, and you shouldn't take away from the fact that they had a conversation today and that they'll meet again in the fall, that we have less concerns over these judicial reforms or less concerns over some of the extremist activities and behavior by some members of the Netanyahu cabinet. Those concerns are still valid.
It's how President Biden described Israel's current government under Netanyahu.
And this is one of the most extreme members of cabinets that I've seen. I go all the way back to Golda Meir.
Here in Israel, before the invitation, former Prime Minister Ehud Olmert called on the United States to reevaluate its relations with Israel. He also advised world leaders not to meet with Netanyahu.
It's not just Ehud Olmert, it's also Ehud Barak, it's also former candidates for Prime Minister like Tzipi Livni and interim Prime Minister Yair Lapid. All of them are lobbying the Biden administration and other world leaders to put immense pressure on Benjamin Netanyahu.
Alex Trayman of Jewish News Syndicate says this kind of lobbying is a first for Israel.
It's absolutely unprecedented, and it's also very, very harmful to the state of Israel, because don't expect world leaders and others to parse between Netanyahu and other Israeli leaders. And what this actually does is magnify opposition to Israel generally, not just to Netanyahu and his policies.
Despite the invitation and phone conversation, deep divisions remain between the White House and Netanyahu on a number of issues, including an Iranian nuclear deal, building settlements in Israel's biblical heartland of Judea and Samaria, plus the ongoing judicial reform issue. Chris Mitchell, CBN News, Jerusalem.
Well, the extreme polarization of politics is not just happening in the U.S., it's also happening in Israel. It's happening in nations, democracies around the world. It seems to be a global phenomenon that parties just can't get together. They can't talk. They can't negotiate. They can't govern. When you have the President of the United States saying a prime minister's government is the most extreme he's ever seen, well, that makes it very hard to sit down and talk. And when you add to that, under the Obama administration, they tried to defeat him in an election. They actually funded the opposition. And now you have this going on. We've got to stop the polarization. That's the enemy. When you start thinking the other side is extreme and you can't even sit down, you can't even invite them to come and talk, well, that's the real problem. In other news, the United States military is beefing up its presence in the Middle East. John Jessup has more on that story from our CBN News Bureau in Washington. John?
That is right, Gordon. The move comes in response to Iran's attempt to seize 2 commercial ships in international waters recently. The Pentagon is sending F-35 fighter jets and a destroyer to the Strait of Hormuz and the Gulf of Oman. This drone footage shows what the U.S. military describes as an Iranian Navy ship approaching an oil tanker in the region 2 weeks ago. The Iranians reportedly firing shots at the vessel in the Gulf of Oman. Iran also harassed another tanker, but departed the scene when the U.S. Navy dispatched a warship. Well, here in Washington, there's a battle brewing over funding for national defense. The GOP-led House passed a nearly $900 billion military spending bill, but it's considered dead on arrival in the Democrat-controlled Senate. As CBN's Caitlin Burke explains, the conflict is mostly about new social policies in the military.
The
The annual defense bill typically receives bipartisan support, but this time around, all but 4 House Democrats opposed the legislation. At issue, a number of GOP-sponsored amendments regarding abortion, transgender rights, and diversity.
It is woefully irresponsible that extreme MAGA Republicans have hijacked a bipartisan bill that is essential to our national security and taken it over and weaponized it in order to jam their extreme right-wing ideology down the throats of the American people.
Republicans continue to keep our promises. Technically, it's a bipartisan vote, but 4 Democrats vote with us. Are the rest of the Democrats against a pay raise for their veterans? Are they against deterring China for a safe future? Are they against rooting out wasteful spending?
The measure that mainly appears to have eroded the Democrats' support, a reversal of a Pentagon policy providing reimbursement for abortion travel across state lines. It's the same policy Senator Tommy Tuberville has been protesting since February by blocking the confirmation of all senior military officers.
Well, good morning, everybody.
Members of the House Freedom Caucus say they hope their defense bill motivates Senate Republicans to back Tuberville's efforts.
Taxpayer money is provided to the DOD and intended to provide for our national defense and our national security. It is not to promote and support the Biden administration's radical, immoral, pro-abortion agenda.
Meanwhile, National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan says the current House defense bill stands no chance of reaching the president's desk.
What's real is the necessary capabilities, technologies, and fundamental social support for our troops and their families. That's what this all should have been focused on, not these domestic political issues.
The Senate now begins debate on its own defense bill, which cleared the Armed Services Committee with bipartisan support just a few weeks ago. When their final version passes, House and Senate negotiators will work on a compromise bill to send to President Biden. Caitlin Burke, CBN News, Washington.
Thank you, Caitlin. Well, turning now to health news and the recent controversy over aspartame. When the World Health Organization declared the food additive could be likely linked to cancer, the FDA quickly disagreed, criticizing the data. But as CBN medical reporter Lori Johnson explains, doctors say aspartame does carry other risks.
Aspartame, which hit the market as NutraSweet some 40 years ago, can be found in more than 5,000 low-calorie and diet products. When the WHO connected it to possibly causing cancer in the liver, the FDA disagreed, citing significant shortcomings in the studies and adding FDA scientists do not have safety concerns.
They all kind of need to get on the same page. There's a lot of controversy there.
The WHO says unsafe levels of aspartame consumption begin at 40 milligrams per kilogram per day, which is the amount in about 9 cans of Diet Coke. The Calorie Control Council stated obviously this level of consumption is not realistic and is among those who accuse the WHO of needlessly scaring consumers.
The main thing is that aspartame is a safe substance, can be consumed in quite large amounts, much larger than the humans generally consume.
This isn't the first time aspartame and other artificial sweeteners have come under fire. For years, doctors have been warning about their impact on the gut microbiome.
That's the balance of good and bad bacteria in our intestines that some say has an enormous impact on our overall health.
Those artificial sweeteners cause a separate breed of bacteria to grow inside you.
Studies show people who drink diet soda are at a higher risk for dementia, stroke, and even weight gain than people who don't.
Here are people consuming diet drinks and gaining weight. And that doesn't seem to make any sense. And yet, we now see that it's happening because of changes in the gut bacteria. The risk of developing diabetes is dramatically increased twofold in people who drink a lot of sugarless beverages.
There's also a phenomenon that happens called calorie dysregulation that they saw with artificial sweeteners. When you eat something that's got a sweet taste with no calories, your body can't calibrate the degree of sweetness with how many calories, so it causes you to tend to overeat.
Most artificial sweeteners have no nutritional value, but neither do many natural sweeteners, so doctors recommend avoiding both.
Sweet is a learned taste. If you go off sweet, if you go off sugar, if your brain doesn't get used to it, if your taste buds don't get used to it, you can avoid it, and that's a much healthier state.
Lori Johnson, CBN News.
Hazards of our craving for sweets. Thanks, Lori. Gordon, back to you.
Well, we've been warning you about aspartame on this show for literally decades. My father really led the charge on that, and I encourage you, if you're drinking a lot of those diet sodas, stop. You have no idea what you're doing to your body. Is America addicted to sugar? I think the answer quite clearly is yes. I was awakened to it back in the 1990s when I moved to Asia, and they just did not eat sweets. And if they were ever served something that had the amount of sugar that you and I take for granted in a slice of cake, they would go, ooh, this is too sweet. They would literally physically react to it. We've developed a taste for sugar. We consume a great deal of sugar, and we need to recognize that appetite that we've created is actually addictive. So we can get off of it. What you need to do is say no to sugar, but I would also add to that, please say no to artificial sweeteners. If you want more information about how you can have a healthy gut, we've got a free packet for you, and let me underline it's FREE, Build a Better Gut, and you can get it by calling us 1-800-700-7000.